Good morning, Crossroads. I am John Groce. I manage our family ministries here. And today we're going to be continuing our sermon series called Summer on the Mount, where we walk through Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, famously known as Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And, you know, the passage that we're going to be looking at today, it kind of reminds me of various people, and we'll get into that a little bit more later on. We all have a tendency in our lives to tell stories and to cast villains in our stories, don't we? About 10 years ago, when I was going through seminary, I was living in a house with 4 other guys. And look, we had some great times in that house. Actually, one of the guys I lived with, he was a groomsman in my wedding. I was a groomsman in his. We got dinner last night. It was sort of like a Father's Day thing. And we're both pretty happy that we're normal, well-adjusted dads with normal lives. Given where we were, especially, I was at like 10 years ago, I was like, I don't know if that's going to happen. But, you know, we were able to do that. And we have some great memories in our times together. And part of telling the story of those times that we had together is also the story of a roommate who lived in that house for the first of the 2 years that we were together, who a lot of us didn't really like. We'll call him Brady. Brady, legitimately, I think he was a narcissist. Actually though. And he would do all kinds of very, very annoying things. He was constantly trying to weasel his way out of paying rent and utilities with as many methods as possible. He would complain about lights being left on and then insist that I had to give him, not everyone else, him though, a break on the utility share, which, by the way, I was always giving everyone just like a few dollars, like a couple bucks off. But anyway, he wanted more because he was not the one leaving lights on and deserved to be compensated. I don't know how you would calculate the amount for that, but that's what he wanted. He worked at a shoe store and would have overstocked shoes that he would obtain for free and tried to sell them to me so that I would not have to collect as big a check from him to deposit to the landlords. He made zero attempt whatsoever to clean up the trimmings when he would trim his beard. And I was a seminarian, and he would always ask me random theological questions. And his goal was he had gotten in a spat with somebody, and someone disagreed with him on something. And he's like, one of my housemates is a seminary student, so I'm just going to ask John something and be like, well, my seminary friend says such and such, so I'm right. I know that was the agenda. That was the agenda every single time. It's really interesting looking at the guys that I lived with at that time and that I still talk to. When we talk about those times, we do look back at a lot of the fun memories, like the time that me and one of my housemates, we made this thing called the Venetian volleyball. I don't remember the origin of the name, but what it was a DiGiorno pizza, a whole bunch of frozen French fries, and then corn dogs, and you just sort of wrap the whole thing together in a burrito and then just eat this mound of junk food all at once. We have all these really, really fun memories, but there's some special ingredient about talking about those wonderful times we had that includes casting a villain in the story. And it's this very human thing that we have a tendency to do, something that Jesus addresses in the last part of Matthew chapter 5, which is what we're looking at today. So where we've been in Matthew 5, we've been in a series of passages that Bible scholars call antitheses. And they are all structured by a formula that, if you've been around at our church in the past few weeks, is probably pretty familiar. It starts like this. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said." He then quotes something out of the Old Testament and then follows that up with, "But I say to you," and then gives an interpretation or an exegesis, an application of that Old Testament command that shows us how to follow that instruction from the heart. So last week, Matt preached to us about the lex talionis, the law of retaliation. And so Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." And Jesus' response is to tell his people to reclaim their dignity, not by asserting the right of vengeance, but to reclaim dignity by actually being overabundantly generous and gracious towards people making unfair demands. And so today we're in a very similar kind of pattern, and it's on a similar topic as what we heard about last week. It's about people who have wronged you, people who have done bad things to you, people you might consider enemies. The passage that we're looking at today, Matthew 5:43 through 48, it begins like this. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, here's what Jesus is doing. You have heard that it was said, followed by an Old Testament quotation, but not exactly. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor. Those words, you shall love your neighbor, they come directly out of Leviticus 19:18, which says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus later in the Gospel of Matthew quotes Leviticus 19:18 and says, it's the second greatest commandment, second only to, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your mind. But this other bit, and hate your enemy, that's not an Old Testament command. There are places in the Old Testament where authors will say, oh, I hate my enemies. But what's going on in those passages is the author is really bringing his own feelings before God. The author has some vengeance to deal with and is bringing that before God. We don't actually have an instruction in the Old Testament saying, hey, you should hate your enemies. But I think there's a very real, very human tendency that this passage is attesting to. We have a very real tendency to pair love of neighbor with casting a villain in the story. One way that worked in ancient Jewish interpretation of things like Leviticus 19:18 is that love your neighbor might be applied with a somewhat limited scope. So for some ancient Jewish communities, love your neighbor meant love other people in your community. In Leviticus 19:34, where we have an instruction to love stranger, it actually wasn't really interpreted as love any stranger. It was love non-Jewish people who converted to Judaism, something like that. And in a particularly sectarian Jewish order, that is, they were kind of off in a corner, living in a commune, kind of like a monk, like a monastic type of thing over by the Dead Sea, the Qumran community. These people had a community order that really leaned into this idea of loving the brethren and in the same breath hating the people who weren't the brethren. So this is an excerpt from a Qumran scroll. It's a scroll that was discovered. It was preserved really, really well because the Dead Sea is kind of dry. So people discovered a little bit of this monastic sectarian order's rule of life. It's this. We do what we do, that they may love all the sons of light, each according to his lot in God's design, and hate all the sons of darkness, each according to his guilt. There's a logic at play in this ancient community rule, which pairs love of neighbor, love of the other people in our community, with hating on and wishing ill, in a way, of the people who are not a part of this community. Now, in our own lives today, we don't exactly operate with this level of melodrama. We know, especially like if we've heard the parable of the Good Samaritan a lot, we kind of know the correct churchy answer for who is my neighbor. Everybody is your neighbor. You're supposed to love everybody. When it comes to the parallel question of who is my enemy, we might not have as ready an answer because when we cast villains in our stories, we might not necessarily think of them as enemy. Like that sounds kind of melodramatic. That sounds not like the way that we usually think of people. But the reality is we are prone to cast villains in the stories that we tell about our lives and about our friendships and about other people. The way it often takes shape, at least in my life, and I think in the lives of many of us, is it takes shape somewhat similar to what Jesus describes in Luke 18. In Luke 18, Jesus is telling a parable of a Pharisee and a tax collector who go to pray. And the Pharisee, he stands near the temple and he lifts his arms before God and he loudly gives this prayer. This Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed like this: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like the tax collector right next to me. Now, this is a parable. It's not a thing that Jesus actually saw. It's not an event that Luke was recording. But I think things like this, it happens a lot. We don't have the audacity to publicly say things like this about the people that we don't like. But deep in our hearts, I think the truth is we offer similar kinds of prayers. We have a tendency to indulge dark beatitudes that distinguish ourselves from the villains in our stories who drive us absolutely bonkers. These dark beatitudes, they might sound something like this. Blessed am I that I am not like Janet in accounting who can't read an email to save her life. Blessed am I that I have a semblance of work-life balance, unlike my coworkers who are always hassling me with the emails they send 17 times an hour. Blessed am I that I have a sense of self-care and actually care about what I look like, and that I wouldn't dress up like a Dixie cup, like Pastor John over there. Or we might say, blessed am I that I'm not self-obsessed and image-obsessed. We might say things like, blessed am I that I am not brittle and inflexible and out of touch like, anyone politically or theologically to the right of me, like those fundamentalist Christians. We might say, blessed am I that I don't play fast and loose with the truth, like those liberal Christians or those liberal people politically or theologically to the left of me. And probably the spiciest example of this that we see all the time is in our politics, and we see it especially because we're in an election year. Right now, both of the major presidential candidates have a net negative approval rating, which means the disapproval rating is higher than the approval rating. So what does that mean with the sponsored media we hear from each of these candidates? It's constantly basically one of these dark beatitudes. It's something like, blessed am I that I am I and not the other guy, which gets tacked on this nice little supplemental message whenever you're listening to this. Blessed are ye that ye support me and not he. And all of this, of course, is symptomatic of the fact that in the United States, we have a profound tendency to look at our issues through the lens of resentment and victimization. There's an author, a sociologist, James Davison Hunter, who has looked at Christian attempts to change the world. And he wrote a book published in 2010 called To Change the World. And he has this really interesting take on Christian engagement with politics, which is basically this. We as Christians want to change the political landscape. And the reality is, ultimately, at the end of the day, that the political landscape has changed Christians by supplying us with a tendency to adopt resentment narratives that we just can't resist. They're so thrilling and intoxicating. For the Christian right, the resentment narrative is something like this. We are entitled to having a country where all of the political and institutional things are supporting our beliefs. But then the secularists had to come and take it away. And then, that's not just the Christian right. The Christian left is, we were entitled to a Christianity and a Christian political engagement that was focused on the love of stranger. And then what happened is the Christian right had to come in and make it about their cultural issues. And you might be sitting pretty thinking like, well, I don't identify with the right or left, so I'm better. But actually, chances are there are resentment narratives that kind of attack that third way as well. There's a neo-Anabaptist movement that tries to be apolitical. They try to be like, no, we're going to be Christians. We're not going to dirty ourselves with all of this political bickering. But the Christian right and the Christian left, those bad people had to come and ruin this purified Christianity that we were supposed to have. Left, right, and center, there's a resentment narrative that kind of runs through. And I think the reality is we kind of love to sit and stew in our resentment narratives because there is something deep in all of us that just loves to say that whatever we don't like, whatever problem there is, it's someone else's fault. Every single one of us just loves to sit in plaintive indignation and sit in grievance and anger and malice and stew in the fact that we are not the people who have dared to wrong us. And we experience that tendency, when it comes to political movements, these current event types of things, at maybe a medium temperature. But I think where we stew in this victim mentality, this resentment, this need to cast villains in the stories about our lives, we probably do that most prevalently when it's really close to home. Blessed am I that I am not out of touch and set in my ways like my parents. Blessed am I that I am not lazy and entitled like the younger generation, and I don't roam through life saying such nonsense as skibbity toilet Ohio Riz. Like, what does that even mean? We might say, blessed am I that I didn't do that thing that my ex did. And, when it comes to me personally, I think a lot of my life and the way that I've seen myself is blessed am I that I am not like so-and-so, people who have hurt those around my family. My sister and I have different dads. My sister's dad, in the mid-1980s, left my mom because apparently his secretary was his destiny, and then a few years later, the secretary made off with the Porsche. Anyway, whatever. It's kind of a weird story because I think, he really didn't treat my mom right, but then also I exist because that whole turn of events. So I have a really complicated feeling about that. But the thing is when I look at my story, even the story that my mom told me about my own life origin, there is a villain in the story. There's a sense of resentment. There's a sense of blessed are you that you're not such and such and so. I look back at the story of living with my buddies in seminary, and it's like, blessed am I that I'm not like Brady, that roommate. And the reality is there are a lot of other grievance and resentment stories that, frankly, I can't share with you from this pulpit. Those are the ones with the real hurt, where abuse has happened to people that I love, where there's been gaslighting, even spiritual abuse. And there's a part of me that just wants to stew in that wants to wish ill of all these people involved. There's a dark tendency that Jesus confronts in this passage. It's in Matthew 5:44 through 45. Jesus says this, "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven." There is a list of people, it's a short list, but there's a list of people where when I think about them, it's kind of like in Kill Bill, where Uma Thurman has that alarm noise going off in their head, and it's just target set. There's a few people where I feel that way. And Jesus challenges me, and he challenges all of us to look at those places where we've been aggrieved and to say, let go of that resentment, let go of that grievance, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, stop casting them as villains in your story, stop defining yourself in distinction from the bad things they did, and love them. And what Jesus is asking here, it's an escalation. It's a truer, more purified form of Old Testament instruction. In Proverbs 24, we have something similar, kind of like this. "Do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and let not your heart be glad when he stumbles, lest the Lord see it and be displeased and turn his anger from him." And so in this passage, what it's saying is, hey, don't be gleeful when your enemy stumbles, because if you become gleeful at someone else's pain, God might be mad at you instead of being mad at the other guy. And Jesus is taking that to the next level. It's like, don't just be kind. Don't just do nice things. Don't just avoid your sense of glee at their sense of failure, but actually love them. Seek their thriving and seek their good. And in Matthew 5:45, Jesus says you are to seek their thriving. You are to love your enemies so that you may be children of your Father who is in heaven. Now we look at this piece. So that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. And we maybe start feeling a little tight in the chest because it's like, wait. Is this like a works righteousness thing? Is this a scenario where I actually can't call myself a Christian if I haven't perfected the art of enemy love? Is love of enemies like an entrance exam into being able to follow Jesus? Because if that's the requirement for me, I might be failing. I might not be perfecting the art of enemy love. Is that what Jesus is doing? And I would say no. Jesus isn't giving you a prerequisite. He's not giving you an entrance exam towards becoming a Christian. A couple reasons for that. One, it comes from the Greek. And in 545, where it says, love your enemies so that you may become children of your Father who is in heaven. That so that there, it's not the causal relationship kind. It's not you do A and then A directly causes B. The so that, it really comes from the Greek word for how. So it's more like you love your enemies, and in this manner, this is what it means to be children of your Father in heaven. As in, you don't love your enemies in order to become children of God. No, you love your enemies because you are God's children. And where does that come from? Well, here's the reality. We do not become Christians, we do not become children of God because we have perfected the art of enemy love. If you look throughout any of Christian history, there are a few radically, wildly exceptional saints who you can look at their lives and be like, wow, they actually did perfect the art of enemy love in this lifetime, or at least got very close to it. But you look at the majority of church history, and most of us, we look at our lives and it's like, no, I haven't perfected the art of enemy love. But here's the thing. We aren't children of God because we perfected the art of enemy love. We're children of God because God perfected the art of enemy love. Paul puts it pretty pointedly in Romans chapter 5. It says this: but God demonstrates his love for us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Let's keep going. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more, now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life. Here's the reality. Your life is not defined by the fact that you are a better person than the people who have wronged you. Your life as a follower of Jesus, as a child of God, is defined by the fact that you are a recipient of enemy love. All of us, apart from the grace of God, would be enemies of God. We would be stewing, biting back at God, barking back at him, snarling, filled with resentment that the creator of the universe would have the audacity to be king of his own creation and not give that crown fully to us. If it weren't for the grace and for the love of God, all of us would be sons of disobedience. All of us would have nothing but anger and resentment and enmity towards God. But God demonstrated perfect love for us by living the life that we couldn't live on our own, by dying the death that we deserve to die. And by loving us, even though naturally apart from the grace of God, we were nothing but enemies of God. And so you can look at those grievances, you can look at those terrible things that people have done to you, the things that you can talk about and the really awful things that you can't share with everybody. You can look at those and you can realize, look, whatever bridge of love towards this person I have to cross in order to actually seek their thriving, it is not greater than that bridge that God crossed to reach out to me. The love that I am being asked to show these other people, it is no greater than the love that has already been shown to me, the love that has already been extended to every single one of us. And if we live our lives from the standpoint of that reality, if we live our lives as recipients of God's love, then we are in a position to flip the script on those dark beatitudes that we carry in ourselves. We can say things inspired by Matthew 5:45, blessed am I that I am like you under the sun of a good God. See, in Matthew 5:45, Jesus reminds us that God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, sends rain on the just and on the unjust. And all of those terms, evil and good, just and unjust, all of those terms are talking about every single one of us. God makes his sun rise on evil people. That means he makes his sun rise on us. He makes the rain fall on unjust people. That means he brings the rain on us. And yet God still extends that same loving invitation to all of us, even though we don't deserve it. God has perfected the art of enemy love. And because of that, we can look at the people who have wronged us and flip the script of our dark beatitudes and say, blessed am I that I am like you, evil and good, just and unjust, and loved all the same. Blessed am I that I am like you, drowning in imperfections and flaws and bright spots, and yet still under the same call and invitation from a loving Father who loves us anyway and invites us to grow and invites us to change. What Jesus suggests with the rest of this passage is that if we live a life defined by this enemy love, then we actually reap flourishing. We reap rewards for that. And he does this really kind of ironic, almost paradoxical thing in the next couple verses. What Jesus does is he's telling us to love our enemies. He's telling us to let go of our selfishness, let go of our resentment. And in the process of doing so, he ironically appeals to human self-interest. That's what goes on in Matthew 5:46 through 47. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? And it's kind of fascinating, right? He's speaking to a largely Jewish audience for whom their identity is built on the idea of being better than tax collectors and being better than Gentiles. And what he's doing is he's saying, don't be selfish, don't be so intense on claiming to your rights as a better than person, or else you won't be better than these other people. It's kind of ironic, a little bit strange that he would do that. But I think there's a couple really beautiful reasons why Jesus does that. One of them, honestly, I think is a word of grace for us. Because here's the thing, we look at our lives, we look at our resentment, we look at our challenge and our inability to love our enemies, and we realize, look, I haven't perfected the art of enemy love. And if I'm real and if I'm honest with myself, I'm as self-righteous as the next person. Whoever it is that ticked me off the most, I'm probably just as self-righteous as they are, if I'm honest. And yet, despite being self-interested people, we are invited on that path towards following Jesus anyway. Jesus invites us to walk the path of discipleship, even though we are not like the kinds of people who have reached the end of that road. He's not requiring us to be done with the journey to start that journey. It's a beautiful thing. It's an invitation sent out to sinners like us. But here's the other thing, the other reason why Jesus is appealing somewhat to self-interest in this passage. See, when he says, don't you want to do better than the tax collectors to his Jewish audience? Don't you want to do better than the Gentiles? When he says that to this Jewish audience, what he's saying is, look, if you live your life in light of this enemy love that has been extended to you, it is going to make you become who you really are. It's actually going to make you more like who you want to be, not less like who you want to be. And as a result, what he's doing is he is inverting this presupposition that causes us to hang on to our resentment, which is the fact that we define ourselves against the people who do wrong to us. We define ourselves against the people who do bad things. But the reality is that that is not the way that we should be defining ourselves. So if you think, blessed am I that I'm not like Janet who can't read an email, aren't you just saying that your whole life is just your ability to read emails? Aren't you actually reducing yourself in that moment? If you say, blessed am I that I am not out of touch like my parents, well, what's going to happen when you're the parents? What's going to happen when you're the senior citizen and the old one? What's going to happen when it's Gen Beta and Gen Gamma lingo that you can't keep up with? Blessed am I that I am not like Brady, my roommate. I mean, look, the reality is that I thought this guy would be, someone to share a house with because he and I did have things in common. Do I really want to cut myself off from those by stewing in resentment? Blessed am I that I am not like my ex or someone else's ex. Blessed am I that I am not like so-and-so in my family who did these horrible things. I mean, if I'm really leaning in to that narrative and that dark beatitude as a way of supporting my self-understanding, what am I doing? What am I accomplishing except allowing someone else's evil to live rent-free in my head? Am I really going to let someone else's evil define me by sitting and stewing and creating a sense of self around the terrible things that they did? See, Jesus isn't asking us to become pushovers. When he says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, he doesn't actually say, make sure that you're being abused by them as much as possible. What he's saying is he's asking us to claim who we really are. And that's what he says at the very end of this passage. And that's really what he's been saying throughout all of these antitheses in Matthew chapter 5. So Matthew 5:48 is the end of the chapter, and it's the concluding piece of not just this instruction, but all the instructions that we've been hearing about for the past few weeks. Matthew 5:48 reads like this: you therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now again, I realize this verse probably brings that tightening in the chest because you're like, I have to be perfect in order to be a Christian? There's a bit of a translation struggle going on here. The word translated perfect, it comes from the Greek word that also means end or goal. Like, be who you really are supposed to be, as your heavenly Father is fully who he is. Another translator might put it something like this: be whole just as your heavenly Father is whole. Be who you really are just as your heavenly Father is who he really is. That's what Jesus invites us into when he asks us to seek the flourishing of the people that we cast as villains in our life stories. Because a life defined by enemy love actually brings us more in contact with who we really are. That's what Jesus has been saying throughout all of these teachings in Matthew chapter 5. He says, don't harbor anger in your heart, because you are more than the wrongs that exist between you and someone else. Don't let lust drive your imagination, because as it turns out, you are not just your hormones. Do not be casual with divorce, because a strong marriage also makes strong women and strong men. Let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that your speech can be whole and truthful and authentic, and you can be who you really are 100% of the time, no matter who it is that you're talking to. Do not be given to retaliation. Love your enemies, because you are an imperfect and flawed person, and your life is defined by the fact that you were an enemy and someone loved you anyway. We are asked to put aside our resentment. We are asked to put aside our anger, because we actually have more in common with our creating and redeeming Father than we would dare imagine or hope. I'm going to go ahead and pray for us. God, thank you for your steadfast, endless, profound, relentless, never-stopping love. Thank you that while we were sinners, while we were enemies, you reached to us, you condescended to us, you loved us anyway. You bridged an impossible gap to love us and shape us and redeem us. Shape and form our lives to be defined by enemy love, to be defined by showing and reflecting the kind of love that you have given to us. Amen. We have reached the part of our service where we take communion. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread and he broke it, saying, "This is my body, broken for you. Take and eat of it." He then took the cup of the covenant and he said, "This is my blood shed for the forgiveness of sins. Take and drink of it." And when we do this, we participate in a Christian tradition reaching all the way back to Jesus himself, where we show that the life that Jesus lived is one we identify with, that the way Jesus walked is also the way that we want to be walking. We're going to stand together. We're going to worship the living God. If anyone needs prayer, there are going to be some people waiting by the prayer banner in the back corner together. Let's gather together as a congregation and worship.